I was just listening to CBN News interview a Dr. Jeremiah J. Johnston, and he is a Protestant theologian, a very well learned man, knowledgeable, has written 15 books, very impressive, much like his Catholic counterpart, who was Protestant, Dr. Taylor Marshall. Now, Dr. Johnston, for years, did not believe that the Shroud of Turin was of Jesus. Now he does, and he is very emphatic that it is. So this to me is interesting based on the fact that both of these men, who are very learned, knowledgeable men, reading the biblical text, embrace the shroud as Rabbi Yeshua. And I'm going to address this because it is of a concern to me, because we're all three, they and myself, are reading the same text, yet we're coming to vastly different conclusions about the Shroud of Turin. So I know that there is scientific testing, and they are saying that this is then very clearly from the 1st century. It's got DNA and blood on it. Now, I do know, when I look at science and we study science and we know how science changes, we also know that science can be, unfortunately, manipulated based on people's biases. We see the same in the medical world with testings and vaccines, and how they push their biases in that world. And I know in the art world, forgeries are made. So this happens across the board. There is no realm of study that has high ethics that can't be robbed, basically. So we look at an Italian chemist who in 2009 replicated the shroud based on everything that was there via chemistry. So just from that person, his name was Luigi, and I think it was Garlaschelli, just from his scientific approach, being able to replicate the shroud based on chemistry that he created, of course, huge questions in my mind. If the shroud is real, then for me, based on what I'm going to talk to you about, it would have to be of another person. It could not possibly be Rabbi Yeshua. Also, just this year, there was a Brazilian 3D artist who used his 3D tools with the technology, and basically proved that the shroud could not have been wrapped around a human, that if it had been, there would be many more distortions to the material, which we don't see. What he did prove was that that shroud was based on a flat, low relief statue. So remarkable. That needs to be looked into further. His name is Cicero Moraes, and again, he's from Brazil, and that was just this year he published his studies. So things like this make me question, but the Bible is ultimately what makes me think this can't possibly be Rabbi Yeshua. Plus the 1st century Jewish practices of burial, which I'll also share. So we look at in Isaiah 53:2, we hear the prophecy of the coming Mashiach Messiah, Rabbi Yeshua. And it says there was nothing to desire him. Absolutely nothing. He was ugly. He was an ugly Jesus. He was not a GQ Jesus. He didn't walk in a room and gave him a second look. Why was that? It's because he needed to be the antithesis of what the culture was espousing as grand and great and even deity. So with the Roman culture, in the Roman Empire, they were pagans. They were worshiping gods and goddesses, and they made statues that represented them, and they were aesthetically magnificent. So God equaled deity equaled beauty. And so when you would look at these gods and goddesses, you saw them as, this powerful presence based on their beauty. And then, of course, you would equate them to being God-like or gods. And so this was an important aspect of the culture at that time that seeped in to the Jewish culture, because we know that the Roman Empire was heavily over the Jewish culture. And so they had a huge influence on many of the Jews and just the impact of beauty. And we know that King Herod was obsessed with building. He expanded the Second Temple. He too was obsessed with beauty. And so the Second Temple was very awe-inspiring. It was glorious. And that's because it was a thing of beauty. So Yeshua being ugly was the antithesis of this culture. God purposely made him that way, I believe, to continue the notion of the low and humble servant that he was. But also, if you were to follow Rabbi Yeshua, you weren't doing it because he was the GQ Jesus. You were doing it because of his words, because of how he was interacting with you, and his miracles and healing. And that is why you were drawn to him. Nothing about his exterior. You know, they say that the Shroud of Turin, it could be a person of up to 6 feet 2 inches. Well, again, height and stature for a male is also seen as something to be highly regarded. And that's a form of beauty, you could say, of recognition and status. Yeshua would have been short and ugly. Again, he was coming as the antithesis of everything in the culture of the time. He was born to poor parents where wealth was pursued. He was not a warrior. He didn't have a mighty army with him, which was key to the existence of that time with their battles. And then he wasn't living in a palace. He wasn't a king. He wasn't someone that you couldn't reach. He was very reachable. He was within the people, walking with the people, going to the local synagogues, going to the temple. Very approachable person, but ugly and poor. All right, so when we look at the shroud, we do not see someone, at least I don't, that's ugly. I see very refined features, very pleasant features, but again, I see a Romanesque nose. That's why if it is real, this shroud, then for me, it would be attributed to a Roman. Also in Isaiah 56, chapter 50, verse 6, it says that Yeshua's beard was torn out. Again, this would be something where he would have followed and abided by the Pharisees, who were encouraging beards at that time of their young men and not to cut them off. And Yeshua, it says, grew in favor with God and men. And so thus he would have obeyed that law that they had in that time. And we know he did because it says, it's prophesied that his beard would be torn out. And of course, that was very demeaning. It was a rejection of him as this Rabbi Yeshua with his beard. And of course, it would have distorted his face because of being ripped out, very bloody. So the fact that the shroud has his beard, that right there dismisses him as Rabbi Yeshua. We know that the earliest portraits of Yeshua did not come during his lifetime. He lived until 30 AD. He was crucified, resurrected, ascended. And it wasn't until 300 AD where we see a representation like this, long hair, the big beard, and the halo behind him. And this was at the behest of the Roman Catholic Orthodox Church. They were combined and then they separated, but they needed visuals for their followers, for their congregants. They were not able to give their people Bibles because the Bible wasn't mass printed until 1400s. So a lot of the stories of the Bible were represented in art. So this is in 300 AD, years after the existence of Yeshua. They want to create an image that then would be replicated, copied, and that would be an icon to revere and worship. So this has nothing to do with what Yeshua actually looked like. And again, for me as an artist, the visual of Yeshua, of Jesus, of Christ that we see today, if I put up a modern rendition, you'd say, yes, that's Jesus. That to me shows the power of art, that you can have a rendering of someone that everyone around the globe views and says, yes, that's Jesus. But that was not Jesus. That was not a Jewish, ugly man. And that is where, for me, this also can't be Jesus in the shroud. Now, it also says he was beaten in Isaiah 52:14 beyond recognition. And that we think about when we see boxers, when they go into the ring, and how, some of their eye is completely covered because the inflammation that happens upon the pummeling. Well, in this verse, it says he's beaten beyond recognition more than any man. So his face was just completely distorted, almost as if this just blob of blood, horrific. So again, we would not have this visual of Jesus, this refined features. That would not have been true. Then we look at the shroud itself, and on the torso of it, aside from the facial part, and again, this is all one piece, which we'll discuss, but that would not have been a traditional way of wrapping the Jewish body. So on the torso, we see these cuts, these slices, and it looks like these wounds of Jesus, but that would not have been true to the whip, the cat of nine tails, that again, Rome had perfected for torture. And those leather strips were embedded with shards of glass, bone, stone, and metal. And you would have, flogged the person, and then those would have caught in the flesh, ripping it from the body. And they said they could do it so much that the bone would be exposed. Horrific, bloody, torturous, excruciating. And this is before the cross. So Yeshua is already dying before he gets crucified. And when he's on the cross for 6 hours, it said, the blood is draining. It's draining through his feet, clearly, and through his side at the end of the 6th hour, when he is, the spear pierces him, and they want to make sure he's dead. They have to take him down because Passover is coming, and they want to give him, Joseph of Arimathea has requested from Pilate to give him a righteous burial. And so that's granted, but so the Roman soldiers need to make sure he's dead, or else they were going to break his legs beneath the kneecap. And that was done so he couldn't pull himself any longer up to breathe, because there was a little platform for his feet that he would press upon to take breath. And so they did not need to break his bones, which was another prophecy fulfilled about Yeshua. No bone would be broken of him. And so when he is taken down, he's clearly dead, and the blood starts to coagulate. And the blood has been draining for the past 6 hours as well. And he actually, this was a very, usually the criminals are on crosses for hours, even several days or even more, if the Romans decide to leave them up to let the birds peck away to the bone. So it was a horrific sight that you would see. And it was again to deter anybody from going against Rome. And so he is taken down, and Jewish tradition was in the burial process is using water to completely wash and bathe, a ceremonial washing of water to clean the body. And of course, all the blood would have been cleaned from his body. Now, Joseph of Arimathea and his friend Nicodemus were both very wealthy Jewish men, both part of the Sanhedrin. And they followed Yeshua. And this goes back to my last video, Jews did not reject Jesus. It was a very few Jews who were there chanting, crucify him. They were parts of the Sanhedrin, Pharisees, Sadducees, along with the chief priest Caiaphas. It was not the majority of the Jewish people. They were following him. Even some of the Sanhedrin did, which we can see by Joseph of Arimathea and his friend Nicodemus. Remember, Nicodemus is the one who had secretly gone to see Yeshua, asking him about being born again. So he is bringing Nicodemus 70 pounds of myrrh, spices, and aloes to cover Rabbi Yeshua's body. Now, this is in John 19:39-40. This is so important to know, because the price of that today, that 70 pounds or 75 pounds, would be $150,000 to $200,000. That is how much they were revering Rabbi Yeshua, how much they wanted to honor him and give him a burial of high status. His status of burial was even more than the leading leader, Jewish leader, Gamaliel. I'm not quite sure of the pronunciation, but he was a highly revered Jewish leader, rabbi, and he wasn't even given this type of burial that Joseph, Arimathea, and Nicodemus were giving to Jesus, Rabbi Yeshua. So the body is washed, then the body is covered with the spices, aloes, and myrrh. And remember, the three wise men, one of the gifts was myrrh. And so then we have the linen pieces, not a shroud. Nowhere in the text in the Bible does it say a full head-to-toe shroud. Linen pieces are wrapped around his hands and feet, his body, the face covering on his neck, and then there would be a separate linen piece, for his head, and a separate linen piece for his neck. And this all would be within the linen pieces. They'd put more of the aloe and the spices and the myrrh. So it was a long process to do this. It was delicate, it was intricate, and it was honoring, such honor given to Rabbi Yeshua with this dedication and this wealth that he was honored with, respected with all of the linens, with all of the spices, aloe, myrrh, and with this wealthy man's tomb, Joseph Arimathea's tomb, which had recently been carved, hadn't even been used yet, and that is where Yeshua was laid to rest. When he is resurrected, the disciples and the women that go to the tomb, they see the linens scattered and the headcloth folded neatly in a different section. Again, similar to Lazarus, when Rabbi Yeshua raises Lazarus, he prays to his father Hashem first, and he calls out to Lazarus. He comes out like a walking dead man. He's got a head covering on, lots of linens on his hands and his feet and his body. So Lazarus was a Jewish man. It was the way that the Jewish people would be buried. Very important, very important. This is why Rabbi Yeshua could not be the Shroud of Turin. God loves you. I love you. God bless you. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem.